Chicago, Illinois, 1973. The city's oldest museum proudly unveiled its new centerpiece for the Civil War display, a human-like wax figure of a black Union soldier. For 60 years, it has been praised for its disturbing realism. In the present, a new curator arrives to restore the museum's Fading Glories exhibitions, examines it more carefully. She is about to find out the realism is no mistake, and that the exhibition is a 60-year-old cold case, hiding a missing man in full view. Dr. Veronica Curtis stepped through the towering bronze doors of the Alcester City Museum. The air greeted her with the scent of old varnish, aging fabric, and the faint sharpness of floor polish, the unmistakable smell of history. She paused, taking it in. This was the kind of place she'd dreamed about her entire life. But this morning felt different. This wasn't just any museum, it was hers. At 34, Veronica Curtis had just become the first black curator in the museum's 150-year history. The atrium stretched high above her, a grand hall of marble columns and distant arches. The light that filtered through the tall, dust-coated windows was weak, casting shadows that clung stubbornly to the corners. Each step she took echoed faintly, as if the building itself were listening. What Veronica didn't know yet was that one of those shadows was watching her back, and had been for 60 years. The Alcester City Museum was a perfect metaphor for itself, grand, revered, and utterly frozen in time. It hadn't just preserved history, it had embalmed it. The air carried the weight of its own legacy, and like its exhibits, the institution seemed content to remain behind glass. But change was coming. By 1950, the museum had already begun to show its cracks, both in its marble walls and in its stories. Now, decades later, Veronica's mandate from the newly modern board was clear: drag this relic into the present. That meant cataloguing every artifact, digitizing its archives, and confronting the uncomfortable truths the museum had quietly buried under layers of polish and prestige. To Veronica, history wasn't a static thing. It breathed, it bled, it demanded to be understood. She often said that a museum wasn't a shrine, it was a courtroom where the past stood trial every day. She knew the assignment was bigger than preservation. It was about honesty. It was about pulling the curtain back, even if what waited behind it didn't want to be found. Her office, a stately wood-paneled room heavy with silence, bore the weight of generations before her. The walls smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke. Above the marble fireplace hung a portrait of the museum's founder, a Victorian patriarch with cold eyes and a beard that seemed carved from shadow. His gaze followed her wherever she moved. Veronica smiled and set her bag on the desk and met his stare. Then, slowly, she placed a small framed photo of her family beside the blotter, a bright splash of color against all that sepia and dust. For a moment, she thought she heard the faint crack of wood behind the wall, like the building had exhaled. Her predecessor, Mr. Hensley, was more than a curator. He was the museum's ghost, still walking its halls. After 60 years at the helm, he had finally retired 3 months before Veronica's arrival, leaving behind an empire of order and dust. He wasn't just part of the old guard, he was the old guard. His name was woven into every display label, every policy, every whispered story told by staff who still lowered their voices when speaking about him. The Alcester City Museum had not merely been his workplace, it had been his reflection. Veronica understood from the start that her audit wasn't just paperwork, it was a quiet revolution. Every file she opened, every artifact she reclassified, was a challenge to a man who still ruled the building in spirit. She wasn't just cataloguing history, she was rewriting it. Her first weeks were spent in the basement archives, a maze of metal shelves and humming temperature controls. Down there, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of old paper and time. She wore gloves to protect the artifacts, though it sometimes felt like they were what needed protection from her touch, from change. The deeper she went, the stranger the quiet became. It was as if the building itself was listening, waiting. Sometimes she thought she heard that same shuffle from upstairs, faintly echoing through the pipes. But when she paused, the silence snapped tight again. The audit was massive. The museum's collection stretched from colonial silver to mid-century modern pieces, but its record-keeping was chaos. Hensley's methods were relics of another century, leather-bound ledgers instead of databases, ink instead of code. Each entry was written in his distinctive, spider-like cursive, a web that seemed to bind the past in place. Veronica ran a gloved finger down one page, the ink faint but precise. His handwriting carried an intensity that made her uneasy, as if every letter had been carved rather than written. That same sense of being watched, the same presence she'd felt in her office, seemed to linger here too, between the pages. She turned another leaf and froze. The next entry wasn't dated, and beside it, unlike every other line, there was no record number, no donor name, just two words written darker than the rest: Union Soldier. It was a rainy Tuesday, 3 weeks into the audit, when Veronica found it. The museum was nearly empty that morning, the sound of the rain on the skylight soft but constant, like fingertips drumming against glass. She had stationed herself in the Americana wing, moving methodically through the Civil War and Reconstruction displays. It was one of the museum's oldest collections, and one of its most distorted. For years it had presented a version of history that was comfortable, not truthful. Her task was to cross-reference each object with its record in the 1970s accession ledger, page by page. Most entries were routine: uniforms, medals, replica rifles, preserved letters. Until she reached the entry for exhibit number 66 and 9 billions, a display in the Divided Nation Hall. The line in the ledger was clean, concise, and deeply wrong. Accession number 66 to 9B. Object: Black Union Soldier, full-scale mixed media, accessioned, October 11, 1973, artist, creator, N.A., donor source, N.A. She read it twice, her brow furrowing. N.A., twice. In the world of museum curation, that wasn't a placeholder. It was a red flag. Every artifact had a history, a trail of ownership, a record of how and why it arrived. Nothing just appeared in a museum, least of all a full-scale human figure. Who had made it? Who had donated it? How had it been acquired? Veronica felt a small shiver trace her spine. She ran her finger over the ink. The handwriting, the same neat, spidery script, was Hensley's, but this line was heavier, pressed harder into the page. The pressure had cut faintly into the paper, as if the pen had hesitated. She remembered the sound she'd heard outside her office that first week, the slow, deliberate shuffle in the hall. The same feeling of being observed crept back now, stronger. It didn't make sense. Mr. Hensley, the man who once scolded interns for misplacing a label tag, had accepted a major exhibit with no paperwork, no provenance, and no signature trail. For someone so obsessively precise, so unyielding about documentation, it was unthinkable. The realization sent a slow, electric unease down Veronica's neck. Every other record from that decade was exhaustive. Silver locket, C-1880, donated by the estate of Mrs. Beatrice Alistista. Confederate musket, model 1861, acquired from the Battleford auction, 1972. Each entry read like a notarized confession, except one. The Union Soldier was a ghost in the books. She went to the steel filing cabinet and found the corresponding folder, 66, 9 billions. It was thin, almost weightless. Inside, a single yellowed index card carried the same meager data as the ledger. No artist name, no donor, no condition report, not even a shipping receipt. Nothing. It was as if the figure had simply appeared one morning in 1973, fully formed, unclaimed, and unquestioned. To anyone else, it might have looked like an innocent clerical slip. But to Veronica, a professional trained to see history as a chain of custody, it was a massive, screaming red flag. It was a silence, and silence in history was rarely accidental. She stared at the card, then at Hensley's handwriting, the same spidery loops, the same faint pressure marks carved into the paper. If the ledger told her what the museum wanted to remember, then that exhibit, that soldier, might tell her what it wanted to forget, and she was done asking permission to find out. They say the eyes in that wax figure still follow you, maybe because he's still trying to be found. Subscribe. Don't turn away from the ones the world already forgot. What had started as a professional audit was no longer just about records. It had become personal. Veronica closed the ledger carefully, the dry scent of dust and old paper rising as she did. Her pulse quickened. There was only one way to settle this. She needed to see the soldier herself. The Civil War wing was one of the museum's oldest and most forgotten spaces. The carpet absorbed every footstep, and the air hung heavy with age. The lighting was dim, tinted amber, the kind of dramatic mood once considered elegant in the 1960s. Now it just felt suffocating. She moved past the expected displays, muskets under glass, faded flags in static poses, wax figures frozen mid-march. The grand Gettysburg diorama loomed in the center of the hall, its painted smoke and papier-mâché soldiers locked in endless battle. But Veronica wasn't looking for the famous scenes. She turned toward the far corner, a small, neglected alcove dedicated to black soldiers of the Union Army. And there, half swallowed by shadow, stood exhibit number 66 to 9B. The figure stood on a low platform, dressed in a dark green wool uniform, his hands resting on the barrel of a rifle. The brass plaque below read simply, "A Union Soldier, C. 1864. Veronica stepped closer, her shoes sinking into the thick carpet. The silence pressed in around her, and she stopped cold. At first she tried to see it as she might any other artifact, an exhibit, a crafted representation of history. The file had called it a wax figure, but as she drew nearer, that illusion broke apart. The realism wasn't artistic, it was visceral. The skin tone, the subtle imperfections, the way the fabric seemed to crease naturally at the joints. It all felt alive. It was unsettling. This was no store window mannequin. This was a work of art so lifelike it bordered on the grotesque, on the uncanny valley that made her skin crawl. The air felt suddenly colder. Veronica took one cautious step closer, reaching out toward the figure's face. That's when she saw it. A thin, dried line of something dark, tracing down from the edge of its ear to the collar. It wasn't paint. Veronica leaned closer, her professional discipline colliding with a cold, instinctive fear. The figure's skin wasn't the polished, artificial surface of wax. It was textured, irregular, human. Up close, she could see it, faint pores scattered across the bridge of the nose, the delicate cross-hatching of fine lines at the knuckles, subtle variations in tone that no sculptor's brush could mimic. The imperfections were too natural, too intricate to be artifice. His glass eyes were fixed forward, wide and unfocused, with a quiet vacancy that felt almost aware, but it was the hands that stopped her breath. They rested on the rifle's barrel, steady, lifelike, disturbingly precise. The fingernails weren't painted shapes. They were formed, curved, translucent. Each had the pale crescent moons of keratin, faint ridges, even a small dark fleck beneath one nail. A speck of what looked like dirt, trapped there long ago. Veronica's stomach tightened. A chill rippled through her. She forced herself to look at the face again. The light from the overhead fixture didn't reflect the way it should. It didn't bounce off the surface. It sank into it, absorbed as though by real skin. Her gaze drifted to the temples, where short, wiry hairs peeked out from beneath the edge of the Union cap. They weren't synthetic fibers. They were rooted, uneven, real. This was no wax figure. This was a presence. Her mind raced, but what was it stating? Was it a masterpiece of hyperrealism from some unknown? Was she looking at a lost masterpiece of realism? Something extraordinary and uncredited? Or was this something else entirely? Veronica took a slow step back, her pulse quickening. She needed to check the materials, the structure, anything that could explain this. But when she turned toward the nearest information plaque, she realized something she hadn't noticed before. There wasn't one. The soldier had no label, no history, no record of existence at all. A wave of inexplicable sorrow washed over the figure as Veronica stared at it. It wasn't reverence she felt. It was grief. The display didn't seem to honor the soldier. It felt as though it trapped him. The piece stood alone in the dim corner of a forgotten hall, not as a monument to history, but as something abandoned, confined. The thought struck her with cold clarity. This wasn't a memorial. It was a prisoner behind glass. The silence thickened, pressing down from every direction. The empty file, the curator's hostility, and now this haunting, almost human figure. The pattern was too deliberate to dismiss. Whatever she'd stumbled into, it reached far deeper than a misplaced record. She was sure of it, instinctively, completely. The certainty wasn't intellectual, it came from the same place that told her the air in the room had changed. She wasn't uncovering an administrative oversight. She was standing at the edge of something deliberately hidden. Her first step had to be careful. The museum's living archive, Mr. Hensley, was her only lead, but a direct challenge would only push him further into silence. The man was a local legend, untouchable in reputation and temperament. If she wanted answers, she'd have to earn his trust first. She dug through the museum's dusty administrative files until she found his number, printed on an aging contact sheet. Her hands hesitated for a moment before dialing. He answered on the third ring. His voice was exactly what she'd imagined. Dry, gravelly, the slow baritone of someone who had spent decades being right. "Mr. Hensley, sir," Veronica said, her tone perfectly measured. "This is Dr. Veronica Curtis, the new curator at the Alcester Museum. It's an honor to be continuing your work." "Dr. Curtis," he replied, the name drawn out with faint disapproval, as though he were tasting something unfamiliar. "Yes, I've been informed. What is it you're calling about?" His voice carried the kind of weight that could close a door before it opened. But Veronica steadied herself. She wasn't calling to flatter him. She was calling to see what kind of man guarded the museum's ghosts, and whether he knew one of them might still be standing inside. "Well, I'm in the middle of my audit of the permanent collection," Veronica began, her tone even and courteous, "and I've come across a puzzling gap in the records. I was hoping you might help me fill it in. It's about accession number 66 to 9B, the black Union soldier figure in the Civil War wing. The file is completely blank. No artist, no donor, no provenance. I wondered if you might recall how it came to the museum back in 1973. There was silence. Not the soft, searching kind of silence that comes from someone trying to remember, but the brittle, defensive kind that means they already know the answer and don't want to say it. When Hensley finally spoke, the warmth in his voice was gone. What remained was a dry, superior tone, steeped in years of unchallenged authority. "That figure," he said, almost laughing at the absurdity of her question. "My dear, that's nothing more than an old wax model. It's been part of the exhibit forever. A local artist's contribution. Eccentric fellow, didn't care for recognition. A donation, if I recall. In my time, we were less obsessed with paperwork and more with preserving history itself." "An eccentric artist," Veronica repeated quietly. "Do you remember his name? For our updated records." "I do not," he replied, curt now, each word clipped. "It was half a century ago. And if I may offer a word of advice, Dr. Curtis, the museum's strength lies in what it collects next. I suggest you focus your considerable talents on what's ahead of you, not on what is long since gone and forgotten." He hung up without saying goodbye. The line went dead. Veronica sat with the receiver still pressed to her ear, listening to the hollow dial tone. His dismissal was too precise, too rehearsed, the kind of deflection that only came from someone with something to protect. She replaced the phone slowly, her pulse thrumming. The more he told her to forget, the clearer it became that she'd touched something no one was meant to find. And somewhere inside that museum, the proof was still standing in plain sight. Veronica sat frozen in her office, the drone of the dial tone still buzzing faintly in her ear. That hadn't been a conversation. It had been a warning, a quiet threat wrapped in politeness. Hensley hadn't forgotten he'd dodged, he'd lied, and worse, he'd done it without hesitation. Just an old wax model. Leave the past alone. The words echoed like an order, not advice. His defensiveness was more than suspicion. It was a confession. Whatever that figure in the Civil War wing was, it wasn't just an exhibit. It was a secret he was still protecting after half a century. The audit was no longer about misplaced records. It was about uncovering the truth Hensley had buried, the truth that still made him nervous enough to warn her away. Ironically, his warning gave her exactly what she needed, a direction. 1973. That year was the hinge. The figure's mysterious arrival, the missing paperwork, the nervous tone in Hensley's voice. They all pointed to a single moment in the museum's past. What had happened in Baton Rouge in 1973 that would make a man like him erase an entire record from existence? Veronica pushed back from her desk and grabbed her coat. The air in the office felt heavier now, the silence charged. She needed distance and answers. She left the museum and drove through the wet, glistening streets toward the city's public library, a place where she'd always felt at home. She wasn't a detective. She was a researcher. Her weapons were different. Reels of microfilm, dusty newspapers, and the raw, unfiltered record of history. The museum's archives were curated lies. The public library held what the city had tried, and failed, to forget. And as she stepped into the quiet archive room, one thought refused to leave her mind. If Hensley had gone to such lengths to hide the soldier's story, then somewhere, someone must have once tried to tell it. She remembered her first day beneath the founder's portrait, his painted eyes fixed on her, a reminder that this place had never wanted her kind rewriting its story. Veronica loaded the microfilm reel marked 1972, the year before the mysterious acquisition. The machine hummed to life, its steady whir filling the dim archive room as the years began to unspool in flickering black and white. Watergate hearings, city council squabbles, old record shop ads promising soul for 99 cents. The past flickered by like a restless ghost, impatient to be seen but unwilling to stay still. She wasn't just searching for a headline. She was searching for an echo, something that had been too loud, too bold, too inconvenient to survive the official record. And then she found it, buried in the archives of the Carolina Voice, the city's small but defiant black newspaper. The name appeared again and again like a refrain. Lionel Cole, a face that seemed to light up every photo he was in. At just 28, Lionel "Lion" Cole was both a musician and a movement, a gifted jazz trumpeter whose songs filled the nightclubs on 3rd Street, and an outspoken activist who filled the streets by day. His trumpet case in one hand, a megaphone in the other, he led marches for housing rights, police reform, and dignity. The city's black community called him their lion, because when he roared, people listened. But in the fall of 1972, the music stopped. The front-page stories that once celebrated his protests were replaced by a single, chilling headline: "Local activist vanishes." Then another: "Lionel "Lion" Cole missing." The reports were sparse, vague, and filled with contradictions. The last confirmed sighting placed him leaving a heated city council meeting, one where he had accused a powerful developer of corruption and racial intimidation. Veronica's eyes lingered on that name in the article. The same developer who, she realized with a jolt, had served on the museum's board. A week later, Lionel's car was found abandoned near the riverbank. His trumpet was still in the trunk. The official narrative, published in the city's major paper, was quick to bury him. It hinted at radical affiliations, whispered about debts, and concluded, conveniently, that Lionel Cole had fled the state. But the Carolina Voice told a different story, one that never got the same reach, one that ended mid-sentence, as if the press themselves had been warned to go quiet. Veronica felt that same chill she had in the Civil War wing, the heavy stillness of a truth trapped behind glass. Back then, she'd stared at a silent figure in a Union uniform. Now she was staring at a living man who had been silenced just as completely. Veronica leaned back from the microfiche reader, her pulse hammering in her ears. The pattern was undeniable now. A prominent black activist vanishes in late 1972, and less than a year later, a hyper-realistic, undocumented wax figure of a black man quietly appears in the city museum, under the watch of a curator who ruled with absolute control. The timeline didn't just line up. It locked together like two jagged edges of the same terrible puzzle. She wasn't just cataloging an artifact anymore. She was investigating a person. The realization pressed against her chest, cold and suffocating. It was still only a theory, a monstrous, gut-deep suspicion held together by fragments and instincts. She had a timeline, a name, a motive buried under decades of silence. But what she didn't have was proof. No tangible thread connected Lionel "Lion" Cole, the charismatic musician and activist, to that lifeless soldier entombed behind glass in the Civil War wing. She needed a bridge, something solid, something physical that could tie the living man from the photographs to the silent one staring out through those eerily human eyes. Veronica turned back to the microfiche machine, her movements sharper now, more desperate. She no longer cared about the big stories. The headlines had lied. What she needed lived in the margins. The small features, the forgotten blurbs, the interviews printed beside advertisements for cigarettes and Sunday sermons. The reels spun faster, the screen flickering with fragments of a lost life. Local trumpeter thrills, sold-out crowd at the Blue Note. Community leader calls for fair housing reforms. Lion Cole, the sound of a movement. Her eyes burned as she scrolled faster and faster until the words began to blur. Reviews of his jazz performances, profiles of his activism, interviews about his childhood in the city. She discovered it in a 1972 human interest feature in the Carolina Voice, a glowing portrait that captured Lionel Cole as the heart of his community. It spoke of his boundless love for jazz, his tireless advocacy, and the way he seemed to carry the city's rhythm in his pulse. But nestled quietly in a paragraph about his boyhood was the detail that stopped her cold. Mr. Cole, affectionately nicknamed Lion since childhood, it read, bears a lasting mark of his fearless spirit. A fall from a treehouse at age 10 left him with a crescent-shaped scar above his left eyebrow. My mother called it my personal moon, he laughed. Veronica froze. A crescent-shaped scar above his left brow. The image of the Union soldier flashed in her mind. The figure's head was tilted just enough for its dark wool cap to shadow most of its forehead. She'd thought nothing of it before. It was part of the authenticity, part of the costume. But now, that shadowed space felt like a secret deliberately hidden in plain sight. A cold, electric dread so powerful it was almost paralyzing seized her. She knew with an absolute sickening certainty what she was going to find. The theory was no longer just a hypothesis. It now had a clear, testable, and terrifying path to confirmation. The answer was in the museum. In the dark, silent Civil War wing, hidden under the brim of a 150-year-old cap, every instinct screamed that she already knew what she'd find beneath that cap. Her theory was no longer abstract. It had a scar, a name, and a terrible direction pointing straight back to the museum. She had to see for herself. The archives had handed her the key, but the lock waited in the dark. That night, the museum became another world. The marble atrium, hauntingly grand in daylight, now echoed like a tomb. Emergency lamps cast dim, unnatural halos across the floor, turning every exhibit into a silhouette that seemed to breathe. The silence was thick, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. As Veronica's footsteps echoed across the hall, she couldn't shake Lionel S. words from that old interview. My mother called it my personal moon. It followed her like an omen, a pale light leading her into the dark. Something shifted in her peripheral vision, a subtle twist of shadow that made her pulse spike. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft, rhythmic echo of her heels against the marble floor. Each step sounded too loud, too alive, in the hollow dark. Her heart thrashed in her chest, wild and desperate, like a trapped bird trying to escape. She knew she was breaking every rule in the book. After hours, access without clearance, unauthorized entry into a secured wing, and soon, the unforgivable act of touching a preserved exhibit. But the rules felt meaningless now. Whatever truth the museum had buried mattered more. The weak glow of her phone's flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness. She moved carefully, guiding herself through the corridors she thought she knew so well. Yet everything felt different at night. The air was colder here, thick with something unseen, like breath that didn't belong to her. She reached the Civil War wing. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. The temperature seemed to drop, the stillness pressing against her skin. Every wax figure, soldiers, nurses, civilians, seemed to turn toward her as she passed. Their glass eyes reflected the flashlight's beam in faint, accusing glimmers. The silence felt aware now, heavy with judgment. And then she saw him. Exhibit 66 to 9B. The black Union soldier stood in his shadowed alcove, the beam of her light trembling as it found his face. He looked impossibly more real in the dark. Not frozen, but waiting. The shadows carved deep lines into his face, making his vacant expression look like one of profound, eternal sorrow. His eyes, half hidden beneath the brim of his cap, caught the light just enough to glint with something that looked too human. "Okay, Veronica," she whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. "Just look." Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. That old warning from childhood. Curiosity's a door, Veronica. Once you open it, you can't close it again. She had laughed at it once, but now, standing before the soldier, she wasn't laughing. Imagine being trapped forever in plain sight, everyone seeing you, but no one realizing you're real. That's his fate now. Subscribe before another soul ends up on display. Her hand trembled so violently that the flashlight beam jittered across the soldier's face like a pulse of nervous light. She steadied it with her other hand, But that one was shaking too. Her fingertips hovered just above the brim of the wool cap, trembling in the stale air. This was it. The line she was never supposed to cross, to touch, to alter, to disturb. It was the cardinal sin of her profession. But she couldn't stop now. She had to know. Veronica drew in took a deep breath, and with the precision of someone handling something sacred, eased her fingers under the brim. The cap resisted, brittle with age, stiffened by decades of dust and static. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, it gave way. The fabric lifted, revealing a small patch of shadowed skin beneath. She raised the flashlight, angling it carefully. The light struck the forehead, and her breath left her in a broken gasp. There it was, a thin, silvery crescent, pale against the dark pigment, subtle but unmistakable, exactly where the article had said it would be. The scar. The world seemed to tilt. A wave of nausea surged through her, so strong she had to grip the edge of the display for balance. The sound of her own heartbeat roared in her ears. She stumbled back a step, one hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a choked, involuntary cry. The flashlight beam jerked wildly across the exhibit, sweeping over the lifeless eyes, the still, perfect hands, and finally back to that small, gleaming crescent moon that shouldn't exist on his forehead. And as the light trembled over the soldier's face, something glinted, a subtle shift, like moisture catching the beam. For an instant, she could have sworn she saw the faint shimmer of a tear at the corner of his eye. It was him. Lionel Cole, the man the city had written off as a runaway, the man the police had quietly abandoned, had been here all along, preserved, displayed, hidden in plain sight, beneath glass and history, transformed into an exhibit meant to be admired, not mourned. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The sheer audacity of it, to erase a man by turning him into a monument, was so grotesque, so calculated, it left her dizzy. She stood frozen in the dark, surrounded by silent figures that suddenly felt like sentinels, witnesses to a truth that had been buried in wax and lies for half a century. The scar had changed everything. Theories became evidence. Suspicion became certainty. In that instant, Veronica was no longer a curator or a researcher. She was a witness, the first living person to uncover an atrocity disguised as art. Her thoughts spun through panic and disbelief before settling into a sharp, terrible clarity. She now understood what the museum had done, but not how they had done it or why. To expose the crime, she needed to trace it back to its origin. She needed to find the lie that had made it possible. The next morning, still haunted by the image of that scar, she went to the city's police archives. A squat, bureaucratic building that smelled of old paper, dust, and cheap coffee. The walls were lined with shelves of forgotten files, the ghosts of cases long ignored. Using her museum credentials, Veronica requested the official report on the 1972 disappearance of Lionel "Lion" Cole. The clerk, a pale, disinterested man with nicotine-stained fingers, disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he was holding a single, pitifully thin manila folder. That was it. The entire record of a vanished activist, a man once powerful enough to shake City Hall. The file couldn't have been more than a quarter-inch thick. Hensley's words echoed in her mind. We were less concerned with paperwork and more with the quality of the history we were preserving. Now, standing under the cold fluorescent lights, she finally understood what that meant. She flipped open the folder. The first page was a police report, the second was a witness statement, the third was missing, a torn edge, a number sequence abruptly broken. Page 3 had been deliberately removed. Behind every vanished face is a warning someone ignored. You've seen what happens when the world looks away. Don't make the same mistake. Grab the Vigilant Parents 2025 Survival Guide today in pinned comment. Learn how to see the danger before it sees your family. Veronica felt her stomach drop. It was the same pattern again. The same hollow shell of a record, as if someone had carefully scraped the truth out and left only the appearance of due process behind. She took a seat at a hard wooden table and opened the folder, her pulse quickening with a familiar mix of dread and anger. Inside was the bare minimum, the initial missing person report, a one-page summary of interviews, and a final conclusion dated just 21 days after Lionel Cole had disappeared. 3 weeks. That was all the time the city had given to finding a man who had once led marches and commanded microphones. The interviews were a farce. One was a short, perfunctory note about a conversation with Cole's distraught sister. Another, a single line from an unreliable street informant who claimed Lionel had fallen in with some radical group from up north. Nowhere was there any mention of the city council confrontation, the one where Cole had openly accused the developer who sat on the museum's board. No mention of his activism, his colleagues, or the people who might have truly known him. The final report read like a script, polished, efficient, and utterly dishonest. It described Mr. Cole, known for his radical political affiliations and erratic lifestyle, as a man who had likely fled the state to escape legal or financial troubles. It was a calculated smear, turning a respected activist and artist into a cautionary tale. Even the discovery of his abandoned car by the river, his trumpet still locked in the trunk, had been twisted into a narrative of deception. According to the file, it wasn't evidence of foul play. It was a deliberate attempt to mislead potential creditors. Hensley's warning echoed again. Focus on the future, not on what's long since gone and forgotten. It wasn't advice. It was an instruction. One generation of officials had followed to the letter. Veronica stared at the final line of the report. Case closed. No further action recommended. But as she turned the page, she saw something scrawled faintly in pencil on the back cover. A single name, half erased, barely legible. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. And it was a name she recognized. The final line of the report froze her. Recommend case be closed as a voluntary disappearance. No further investigation required. Veronica felt a surge of heat rise through her chest, sharp and consuming. Not fear this time, but fury. This wasn't negligence, it wasn't oversight. It was an erasure done with intention and precision. The police hadn't simply failed Lionel Cole. They had buried him in bureaucracy. They had taken the heartbreak of a black community, the disappearance of its most powerful voice, and reframed it as a cautionary tale. In their version, Lionel wasn't a victim. He was a problem that had solved itself. That single sentence wasn't just an ending. It was the cornerstone of a cover-up. The moment the police had stamped voluntary disappearance on his file, Lionel Cole had been erased from every official channel that might have remembered him. He had become a non-person, a man no longer searched for, no longer spoken of, no longer real. And in that void, that vacuum of institutional silence, a museum curator, a corrupt developer, a city official, to take possession of his remains and turn him into a grotesque silent trophy. Veronica looked back down at the report, her vision blurring with anger. Beneath the typed line, faintly visible under the page light, was an indentation, the ghost of a second signature that had been erased. Whoever had approved the cover-up hadn't acted alone, and the name she was about to uncover would drag the city's past screaming into the present. The police file and the museum's accession record fit together like twin blades, two halves of a single deliberate deception. And now Dr. Veronica Curtis stood squarely between them, alone and exposed. She was a black woman, new to a prestigious institution built on white marble and older loyalties, and she had uncovered something that could shatter its foundation. The truth she held wasn't just inconvenient. It was catastrophic. There was no one she could safely turn to. The museum's board? Impossible. They were the very architects of the culture Hensley had ruled. The developer, Lionel Cole, had once accused, the man whose name still appeared on donor plaques, was almost certainly among them. To them, Veronica would be a liability, not a curator. They wouldn't listen. They would protect the legacy, protect Hensley, and destroy her career before she could speak a word. The police? Equally impossible. The 1972 report had already revealed their hand. An institution that had helped erase Lionel Cole once would not hesitate to do it again, metaphorically or otherwise. The system had buried him once in silence. It would bury her in discredit. So she was left with herself, the files, the scar, and the dreadful certainty of what she'd found. It was her word against the reputation of an entire city. And that meant she needed something more, something irrefutable. Not a theory, not a file. Proof, something that science could not argue with, and history could not rewrite. She didn't just need to tell two. The mystery that had consumed Maya, the question of who and what the uncanny figure truly was, had finally been answered. But as the truth settled over her like a storm cloud, she realized this was not closure. It was ignition, the beginning of something far greater and far darker than she could have imagined. The real questions were only now surfacing. Who had pulled the trigger? How had his body been preserved with such precision? Who had delivered him to the museum, and who had allowed it to remain there, untouched, unquestioned for half a century? Did the chain of guilt end with Hensley? Or did it climb higher, through the museum's board, the donors, even city officials who had long since buried the story? Maya and Ben worked in silence, methodically packing away the X-ray equipment. The jittery excitement that had filled the room hours earlier had been replaced by something heavier, a grim, unspoken resolve. When they finally stepped out into the pale pre-dawn light, the museum loomed behind them like a mausoleum, its windows dark and watchful. Maya knew she was not walking away from a solved mystery. She was stepping into a battlefield. She was no longer just a curator safeguarding history. She was the lone keeper of a truth buried for 60 years. Lionel Cole, the man erased from the record, finally had someone who could speak for him. And for Maya Whitewood, this was only the beginning. The world, what the museum had done, she needed to show it. That meant one thing. She had to find out what was inside the figure. She spent an entire day pacing her small apartment, every option running circles in her mind, every possible ally weighed and discarded. There was no one she could trust within the museum, no one in city government, no one who wouldn't either leak the story or shut her down. And then, suddenly, a name surfaced. Ken Brooks. Ken had been her anchor back in graduate school, two broke scholarship kids surrounded by wealth and arrogance. He was brilliant, grounded, and the kind of person who didn't flinch when things got strange. He was now a senior radiology technician at the city's largest hospital, someone who had access to exactly the kind of imaging equipment she needed. Her hands were trembling when she finally made the call. "Ken?" she said when he answered, her voice low, controlled but tight with fear. "It's Veronica. Veronica Curtis." "Veronica? No way. It's been, what, 2 years?" His familiar warmth poured through the line, instantly softening the tension in her chest. "I heard you landed the big curator job at the Whitlock. Look at you, Dr. Curtis, conquering the museum world." She forced a small, humorless laugh. "Yeah, something like that." She hesitated, then took a breath. "Listen, Ken, I need a favor. A really big one. Off the books. And you can't ask me why." The silence that followed stretched just long enough to make her stomach drop. When he finally spoke again, the warmth in his voice had shifted, replaced by wary concern. "Okay," he said slowly. "You're starting to freak me out, Veronica. What exactly are you asking me to do?" She glanced at the clock. If Ken agreed, she'd have one shot to do it before the museum opened. One night. One scan. One truth she might not survive uncovering. "I can't explain it over the phone," Veronica said, voice low and clipped. "Not everything. But I'm looking into a possible art forgery at the museum. An old, valuable piece. The only reliable way to see the internal structure is with an X-ray. A portable digital X-ray." There was a beat of silence on the line, long enough for her to feel it sink into her bones. Then Ken's incredulous laugh, half amusement, half alarm. "Let me get this straight. You want me to sneak a $500,000 piece of hospital equipment into the museum in the middle of the night so we can X-ray a statue?" "Yes." She didn't bother softening it. "I know how insane it sounds, but Ken, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't necessary. This isn't about market value. It's about a story that someone tried to bury. I'm the only person who's seen the link, and I need proof." Another long pause. In the background, she could hear the faint, clinical beep of hospital life at his end of the line. Then Ken's voice, quieter, practical. "Security's laughable there, right? Old sensors, half the cameras probably loop old footage." "Hensley never upgraded a thing," Veronica said. Relief threaded through her words despite the danger. "If we time it right, we can get in, get the scan, and get out." Ken sighed, a reluctant, heavy acceptance. "Okay, Veronica, I'll help. But we do this my way. If we get caught, you're the one explaining it to my director, the police, and whatever else shows up. No surprises." They made a pact in hushed tones, an off-the-books, high-risk plan drawn between friends who owed each other a past and perhaps a future. Ken would supply the portable X-ray and the technical know-how. Veronica would supply access, timing, and the courage to cross whatever line had already been crossed in that museum. The alliance was formed. The covert after-hours operation was set. She had her proof, and she had her accomplice. Now she just had to pull off the most terrifying and important act of her entire life. If the machine showed bone where bone shouldn't be, there would be no going back. Would Ken's scanner reveal artifice, or evidence that would topple a city? The night would tell. The night of the operation was moonless and cold. The city a husk of sound with only a distant siren cutting the dark. Veronica met Ken at the museum's iron service door at 2 a.m. He wore dark clothes, looked pale and wired, and dragged a heavy rolling hardshell case, the portable X-ray unit, behind him. "You look like you're about to rob the place," Ken whispered, voice frayed. "You look like you're about to help me," Veronica replied, trying for a joke that died in the thin night air. She produced her new master key and bypassed the alarm the way she'd learned in week 1, a clumsy analog system that smelled of dust and neglect. The heavy door protested and then groaned open. They slipped into the loading bay, and the museum took them in. At night, the building was another creature. Daylight's quiet dignity gave way to something colder and more severe, a tomb of shadowed forms and hulking displays. Every small noise ballooned. The closing door sounded like a gunshot. The wheels of Ken's case thundered on the concrete like a freight cart. The echo of their breath felt indecent in the galleries. Quietly, Veronica hissed, though Ken was already moving as silently as he could, guided by the light of her phone and the map she'd memorized. They moved through the dark with the cautious stealth of burglars, their phone lights cutting thin blue paths across the galleries. Around them the exhibits towered, a silent, glass-eyed army judging every step. A suit of armor caught the flashlight and flashed like a ghost. The mastodon skeleton threw a spidery silhouette across the wall. They felt like trespassers in a house of the dead, aware of the building's history leaning down on them. At last, they reached the Civil War wing. The air felt colder here. The quiet had a weight to it. In the shadowed alcove, the soldier waited, a human-shaped absence in the gloom. "That's it," Veronica breathed. Ken let out a low, shaky whistle. "Wow, that is lifelike. Creepy as hell. You weren't lying." They moved fast, controlled by nerves and training. Ken popped open the case with efficient motions, then set the portable X-ray emitter on one side of the figure and the digital detector plate on the other. He connected the rig to his laptop. The machine's soft chime sounded oddly ceremonial in the hushed room. "Okay," Ken whispered, fingers hovering over the keys. "This is it. 30 seconds for a clean image. On my mark." Veronica held her breath. The only sound in the cavernous museum was the faint, high-pitched hum of the X-ray unit as it powered up. A thin, electric thread of sound vibrating through the dark. It was the sound of a secret buried for half a century, seconds away from exposure. The 30 seconds of scanning felt endless. Veronica stood perfectly still, her pulse hammering so violently it felt like it might shake the air itself. The machine's hum filled the silence, steady and fragile, like the breath of something ancient waking up. Then it stopped. "Processing," Ken whispered, his voice unsteady. On the laptop, a thin white line began to crawl down the screen, the image taking shape pixel by pixel. At first, it was nothing but shapeless grey fog, blurred contours that could have been plaster, wire, or wood. Veronica prayed that's all it was. She wanted to be wrong, desperately wrong. But as the scan sharpened, her stomach turned to ice. The shapes were too symmetrical, too organic. The faint outline of a ribcage emerged, the curve of a spine, the unmistakable structure of a human skull. Veronica's breath hitched, a strangled gasp tearing from her throat. Ken froze beside her, his eyes wide in disbelief. They weren't looking at an armature. They were looking at a skeleton. They turned him into an exhibit, a lifeless version of the man he once was. The world moved on, cameras flashed, and no one saw the truth. Behind the stillness, behind that empty stare, he's still there, waiting for someone to see more than wax, to remember who he was before they turned him into a spectacle. Subscribe, before his face and name fade forever. The image on the laptop screen came into focus. A delicate lattice of ribs, the sweeping curve of a clavicle, the perfectly aligned vertebrae of a human spine. No plaster, no wooden core, No wire armature, every line, every shadow was human. "Ken," Veronica's voice cracked, barely audible. "Oh my God," Ken whispered. His face had gone pale, his eyes locked on the screen with horrified fascination. He adjusted the contrast, his fingers trembling. A new image appeared, the hand resting against the rifle. The scan revealed each fragile bone with sickening precision. The slender phalanges, the delicate branching joints, the unmistakable anatomy of a real human hand encased within the wax form. "It's real," Ken breathed, his voice hollow. "Veronica, it's all real. Every inch of it. You're not looking at a sculpture, you're looking at a preserved body." The word hung between them, heavy and terrible. Body, clinical, detached, and yet in that moment, it was the most horrifying word she'd ever heard. Veronica's legs gave out, and she caught herself against the nearest display case, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Every connection she had made, the scar, the missing file, the lifelike texture, snapped together into one unbearable truth. This wasn't art. It was evidence. They turned him into an exhibit, frozen, forgotten, unseen, but in real life it starts long before that moment. One message, one stranger, one mistake. Don't be the parent who says, "I never saw it coming." Get the Vigilant Parents 2025 guide in pinned comment. Learn the warning signs before danger finds them first. The museum, for 60 years, had been displaying a person, a missing man. The grotesque weight of that truth crashed down on Veronica, crushing the breath from her lungs. The Black Union soldier wasn't a sculpture. He was Lionel Cole, silenced, sealed in wax, and he had been here, silent, staring for her entire lifetime. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Every exhibit around her felt suddenly alive, whispering, accusing. She'd uncovered the city's most horrifying secret, and now she was trapped inside it. Then Ken's voice sliced through the fog of her shock. "Wait," he said sharply. "Hold on." His tone had changed. No longer disbelief, but alarm. Veronica turned. Ken was hunched over the laptop, his face lit by the cold glow of the screen. Zooming in, he muttered, fingers flying. The image of the ribcage expanded, pixel by pixel, the ghostly white bones filling the monitor. "Right there," he said, pointing with a trembling hand, "in the chest cavity where the heart is." Veronica leaned closer. Between the faint outlines of the fourth and fifth ribs, something gleamed. A perfect, bright white circle, impossibly dense, haloed by a faint metallic distortion. Not bone, not wax, metal. "What is that?" Ken whispered, though deep down they both already knew. It's metal," Veronica said slowly, her voice trembling as her mind began to assemble the pieces she had been too terrified to name. Her analytical instincts kicked in, clinical, methodical, but every word felt like glass in her throat. Ken leaned closer to the monitor, his tone grim and steady. "It's more than metal, Veronica. Look at the density, the symmetry. That's a small caliber round." He swallowed hard. "It's a bullet." The word struck her like a hammer to the chest, a bullet, lodged inside his ribs. In that instant, the entire story, the vanishing, the museum's acquisition, Hensley's warning, fell into a single, horrifying alignment. This wasn't just a case of a misplaced body or a grotesque curatorial crime. This was an execution, carefully disguised as art. The presence of the bullet transformed everything. Lionel Cole hadn't vanished. He hadn't run away, hadn't gone underground, hadn't simply been lost to time. He had been silenced, violently, deliberately, and then paraded in front of the public as a piece of history. The old police file, with its sanitized phrases and bureaucratic detachment, wasn't incompetence. It was complicity, a weapon of erasure, written to bury the truth as deeply as the bullet now buried in his chest. The figure before them was no longer just a grotesque relic of preservation. He was the victim of a buried tragedy, a man whose story had been swallowed by time and silence. The proof of that violence, the irrefutable evidence of a crime, had been here all along, hidden in plain sight for 60 years, masquerading as history while the truth was quietly erased by the very people sworn to protect it. Veronica slowly backed away from the laptop, her eyes locked on the X-ray still glowing across the screen, the ribcage, the skeletal hand, and that small, unmistakable fragment lodged deep within the chest. She turned toward the exhibit itself. The black Union soldier stood motionless in the dim light, glass eyes staring into nothingness, his presence suddenly unbearable. And in that moment, the full weight of the revelation crushed her. This wasn't an exhibit. It wasn't an artifact or a tribute to the past. It was a crime scene, a preserved monument to an unpunished act of violence, displayed behind glass for generations to walk past and never question. Her breath hitched. The museum, her museum, the institution she had dedicated her career to defending, was no innocent custodian of history. It was complicated. For 60 years it hadn't been preserving art. It had been preserving evidence. It had been displaying a victim. Hensley's warning echoed in her head again. Some histories aren't meant to be uncovered. Could this mean danger for her? The museum had done the unthinkable. It had taken the preserved remains of a missing black man, a respected community leader whose loved ones had never stopped searching, and hidden him in plain sight. They had dressed him up, turned his suffering into a display, transforming a human tragedy into a grotesque public exhibit and an anonymous spectacle. The so-called accession in 1973 hadn't been a donation. It had been a disposal. The missing file wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated act of erasure, and Mr. Hensley, the once revered curator whose authority had shaped the museum's legacy, was no harmless old man guarding a forgotten secret. He was the keeper of a crime. A man who had either orchestrated this atrocity or knowingly helped bury it for decades. A deep, cold fury surged through Veronica, a fire that burned away every trace of fear. The fabricated report from 1972, the one that dismissed Lionel Cole as a runaway, wasn't just a lie, it was the original sin that made all of this possible. The system hadn't merely abandoned him, it had condemned him, handing his body over to an institution that, in the most macabre and deliberate way imaginable, had completed his erasure. The Wax Museum story may end, but in real life these disappearances don't. They start with trust. They end with silence. Break that silence. Protect your family. Get the Vigilant Parents 2025 Survival Guide free today and learn what no one else will tell you until it's too late. The mystery that had consumed Veronica, the question of who and what the uncanny figure truly was, had finally been answered. But as the truth settled over her like a storm cloud, she realized this was not closure. It was ignition, the beginning of something far greater and far darker than she could have imagined. The real questions were only now surfacing. Who had pulled the trigger? How had his body been preserved with such precision? Who had delivered him to the museum? And who had allowed it to remain there, untouched, unquestioned, for half a century? Did the chain of guilt end with Hensley? Or did it climb higher through the museum's board, the donors, even city officials who had long since buried the story? Veronica and Ken worked in silence, methodically packing away the X-ray equipment. The jittery excitement that had filled the room hours earlier had been replaced by something heavier, a grim, unspoken resolve. When they finally stepped out into the pale pre-dawn light, the museum loomed behind them like a mausoleum, its windows dark and watchful. Veronica knew she was not walking away from a solved mystery. She was stepping into a battlefield. She was no longer just a curator safeguarding history. She was the lone keeper of a truth buried for 60 years. Cole, the man erased from the record, finally had someone who could speak for him. And for Veronica Whitewood, this was only the beginning.